Donbass since 2014 with Russia's backing. Now, these so-called People's Republics make up around 1/3 of the Ukrainian districts of Luhansk and Donetsk. And there's what's called a line of control, with the separatists on one side and the Ukrainian forces on the other. They've been fighting each other off and on across that line for years, even though there's supposed to be a ceasefire. One thing to keep in mind is that the separatists lay claim to all of Luhansk and Donetsk, not just the 1/3 they control now. And Putin confirmed that Russia's recognition of the independence of these so-called People's Republics also includes their claim to that extra territory. Now, President Putin made another big move. He's ordered Russian soldiers to go into the separatist areas. He says they're peacekeepers.
We've been speaking to people inside the self-declared Republic of Donetsk. They were describing the Russian military build-up as being like nothing they'd seen before. They described tanks, Grad missile systems.
So this is a really big deal, because it raises the risk of a direct confrontation between Russian and Ukrainian forces, and that could trigger something even bigger, maybe a full-blown war. Don't forget, Russia looks ready for one. It's been building up troops along Ukraine's border for months. The U.S. reckons there are now up to 190,000 soldiers surrounding Ukraine on 3 sides.
Everything from, of course, the high-end weapon systems to field hospitals to logistics to command and control.
Okay, so next question. Why did Putin make this move in eastern Ukraine? Well, you can answer that on a few different levels. There's the on-the-ground stuff. Putin says Russian speakers and Russian citizens living in eastern Ukraine have been under attack all these years by Ukrainian forces, and they need protection. And recently, separatist leaders started evacuating people to Russia. They accused Ukraine of planning a military operation to retake the territories. But Ukraine rejects that accusation, and the US, NATO, and others think Putin has just been cooking up an excuse to go in.
President Putin made a series of outrageous, false claims about Ukraine aimed at creating a pretext for war, and immediately thereafter announced Russian troops are entering the Donbass. He calls them peacekeepers. This is nonsense. We know what they really are.
So why might Putin be willing to consider a war? Well, that takes us to the other thing he's been talking about a lot: NATO, the Western military alliance, and what he feels is an intolerable threat to Russian security. Putin has basically been telling NATO to get out of his neighborhood. He wants guarantees that it will never admit Ukraine as a member and stop any further expansion to the east. NATO says it will never agree to that Ukraine is a sovereign country and that it's not for Russia to decide, even though it's pretty unlikely that Ukraine would join NATO anytime soon. But here's another thing. When Putin announced Russia's recognition of the breakaway areas, he gave a long, rambling speech complete with his own take on history, which included the idea that Ukraine is part of ancient Russian lands. He essentially questioned the whole legitimacy of Ukraine as an independent country.
Итак, начну с того, что современная Украина целиком и полностью была создана Россией. Точнее, большевистской, коммунистической Россией. Украина, по сути, никогда не имела устойчивой традиции своей подлинной государственности.
The speech by President Putin, the 65-minute long diatribe, many analysts have said it's a declaration of war. He's not invading because it's not a sovereign country. That's his narrative.
Okay, so next question. What's the response been? Well, from Ukraine and the West, outrage, basically.
Україна однозначно кваліфікує останні дії Російської Федерації як порушення суверенітету та територіальної цілісності нашої держави.
Who in the Lord's name does Putin think gives him the right to declare new so-called countries on territory that belong to his neighbors? This is a flagrant violation of international law.
This is the most dangerous moment in European security for a generation.
And what are they doing about it? Well, for a while now, Western countries have been sending weapons and money to Ukraine. And they've beefed up troop numbers in nearby NATO countries, places like Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states. And now they're hitting Russia with economic sanctions, targeting people and organizations connected to the decision to recognize the breakaway areas, and with links to Russia's military. So, for example, wealthy individuals, politicians, and some banks. Germany's made a big move. by suspending the final approval for Nord Stream 2, a major gas pipeline from Russia which has already been built. And Western leaders say they've got even tougher sanctions ready to go if they need them.
Something in reserve in case Putin goes further, because to recognize these two republics, he didn't need more than 150,000 troops, and many fear that there is another stage to his operations.
Okay, so final question. How are Ukrainians feeling about all this? Well, of course, it depends on who you ask and where they live. Some people are scared, but many Ukrainians also seem to be getting on with life as best they can.
People are remarkably calm, actually, and since this whole crisis kicked off, they've been incredibly stoic in their response, and it kind of runs really counter to the panic that has been splashed across Western headlines. I think there is a kind of level up of panic, but I think it's still so unclear about what's going to happen. So it's so hard to prepare when you don't know what you're preparing for.
Якось не знаю, і бояться, і не бояться, поки немає за що бояться. Ну, щось я дивлюся теж ці передачі, щось розказують, ну, мені щось не віриться.
The diplomatic here is over, and what I'm gonna say, that's crazy, because we don't want a war.
Так усе надоїло нам от це жити вже за 8 лет. 8 лет це отак не живемо, существуємо.
That's the thing with this crisis. It's not new, but it's definitely gone up another notch. Now, if you were hoping for answers to the biggest questions in all this, what does Putin really want? And how far is he willing to go? Well, there's really only one person who can answer that.